Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the 2024 Nanovic Forum Lecture. My name is Clement Sedmak and I serve as Director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. I wouldn't need a script for that, so I remember. Nanovic Institute for European Studies. Welcome all. A special word of welcome to our guest of honor, Ambassador Catherine Arnold, OBE. I would also like to especially welcome Father Paul Coleman, whose birthday is today. Thank you so much for being with us, Paul. Dear faculty fellows, that's the spirit. Spend your birthdays and feast days with us here at the Nanovic Institute. But what I mean us, it's Catherine Arnold. Catherine has been graciously with us for 2.5 weeks now as our diplomat in residence, teaching and interacting with our diplomacy scholars and helping the Institute think about diplomacy and potential pathways forward. She's a delight to be with, and it has been a huge privilege to host this extraordinary person. This is our Nanovic Forum Lecture 2024. The Nanovic Forum is a signature event of the Nanovic Institute. It deepens Notre Dame's connections to Europe by bringing distinguished guests to campus to explore, discuss, and debate the most pressing questions about Europe today. The Nanovic Forum Lecture Series is a particular gift of Robert and Elizabeth Nanovic. Sadly, Bob and Liz cannot be with us in person tonight, this afternoon I want to say, but they will receive the video recording and we are sending our grateful greetings, so be careful which questions you ask. Bob and Liz have created our institute with an inspiring vision, having generously provided for our institute and for this lecture. And they also have supported the construction of Nanovic Hall. Thank you, Bob and Liz. I would also like to acknowledge Jim McAdams, who was the director of our institute for 16 years and is probably Bob's best friend on campus. So thank you for being here, Jim. The Nanovic Institute's mission is to bring Notre Dame to Europe and Europe to Notre Dame. Today, we will connect Europe and Notre Dame through a person who has done a lot to forge transatlantic ties. As master of St. Edmund's College, University of Cambridge, Catherine Arnold has been the key person in establishing a partnership between St. Edmund's College and the University of Notre Dame. Catherine brings an impressive global experience to her responsibility as master of Cambridge College, St. Edmund's College, Cambridge. Born in South Korea and having grown up overseas, she worked as a journalist and then served with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the United Kingdom, with posts in Oman, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. In 2015, she was appointed as the British ambassador to Mongolia, where she served until 2018. Following her ambassadorship, she led units within the Foreign Service Office, including the Illegal Wildlife Trade Unit, and helped the UK secure its bid to chair the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26. Catherine Arnold studied as an undergraduate and for an MPhil at Trinity College, Cambridge. She also holds an MA in Religious Conflict from the University of Nottingham and has attended the Higher Command and Staff course at the UK Defence Academy. She has done a lot of thinking and thinking about thinking. The topic today, diplomatic thinking, lessons informing thinkers and leaders. Catherine will talk for about 29 minutes, 33 seconds. Then we have a little exchange, and then we open up for questions, gentle, polite questions, and end at 1:30. Yeah, Catherine, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to start with a very brief but nonetheless heartfelt thank you to Notre Dame for, this is the third visit that I have made since being Master of St. Edmund's, and every single time I come, it has been an absolute joy and pleasure to get to know you as a university and the many people herein better. Particularly during this visit, a thank you to Professor Sedmak and to everyone within the Nanovic Institute and indeed the Nanovic family for this opportunity. So thank you. And it's an absolute joy to see so many of the students from the diplomacy class here today who it's been a pleasure to be with over the last 3 weeks. So thank you all very much indeed. More photographs were taken in 2015 than in the previous history of photography. That would be an extraordinary fact, except it isn't true. Well, not exactly. The author of this fact created it to make a point about the complexity of trying to reach approximate estimates in the absence of solid data. It does, however, I think, illuminate a problem we are all grappling with, individually, as a society, and politically. The problem of human exchange in a globalised world that has topped 8 billion individuals. 8 billion individual people who aren't necessarily that keen on being approximately estimated, but would rather be acknowledged and understood by someone. 8 billion people who, metaphorically, and often quite literally, want someone to react to their picture of cheesecake. The challenge of exchange, perhaps more crudely of communication, has always existed. In many religion and myth traditions, there is a moment when one becomes two, a moment when the individual is given the extraordinary ability to transcend their individuality and become more than themselves, precisely because there is another who is not them. But a moment also when meaning first fails to leap across the gap and misunderstanding and contest arises. Arguably, the greatest challenge of our age is therefore communication, because it sits at the heart of everything else we need to do. There is the superficial, if incredibly important, challenge of the tools and means of 21st century communication. These range from the radical exposure of the individual to an often unintermediated public via social media, to the growing use and sophistication of deepfake technology, to algorithms that increasingly curate the way we think and feel. I call them superficial because sitting underneath this sound and fury reverberating through each of our lives every day is perhaps something more simple and more complex. What does it mean to be an individual human in the context of 8 billion individual humans? Pope Francis said in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, recognising that all people are our brothers and sisters and seeking forms of social friendship that include everyone is not merely utopian. It demands a decisive commitment to devising effective means to this end. And never has the scale of the challenge and the urgency, therefore, of this commitment been greater. Less than a century ago, the world was home to 2 billion people. Is this a 4 times more challenge? Or the challenge of 6 billion more people within the lifetime of a few? What our answer to that question is has perhaps never been more important. Although the question and the pointers hesitatingly offered in this talk are not new. The challenge is one of scale, not substance. That scale cannot, however, be ignored, and institutions of higher education must reaffirm their commitment to helping form thinkers and leaders who are able to create positive and shared futures in an increasingly noisy, dissonant, and fractured world. We also need to make sure that what we do truly is still effective. What was effective 30 years ago even might not necessarily still work today. Modalities, as well as content, can legitimately demand refreshment. For me, it is a career in diplomacy and a lifetime moving around the world that informs both how I view and address this challenge. Many of the tools of diplomacy are relevant, I would argue, to all parts of human life. The global and mobile view gives an important perspective, but one that can equally blinker people like me to the visceral importance of specific narratives or concerns within a local or national context. Contexts that for billions of people in countries across the world are far more immediate, relevant, and important than often complex global structures and discourse. One calls to mind the infamous statement of the then British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain in 1938 in response to growing concern about German Chancellor Adolf Hitler's ambition to take over Czechoslovakia, a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. It's one of the reasons, perhaps, that I am head of Cambridge's most global college, in which our 1,000 members come from over 80 nationalities, and our largest minority, our British students, only comprises 35% of the total. St Edmund's is an exceptional microcosm in which we can prepare our members for transformational encounter with difference, to enable them to gain the tools and experience that will, we hope, enable them to reach across divides, to create shared and positive futures wherever across the globe they will go on to exert their influence. As an institution, we nonetheless sit within global contexts that inform our reality and which we need to take seriously, while also ensuring we have the strong, mission-aligned partners such as the University of Notre Dame to enable us to recall and retain our truly global focus. So to frame today's talk on diplomatic thinking, lessons informing thinkers and leaders, I'm going to divide it into 3 sections: space for dialogue, space for tension, space for movement. My use of the word space is in all its senses: spatial, temporal, and figurative. There are many quips about diplomacy, the profession I have spent most of my career in prior to moving to Cambridge to become, as Clemens has already said, the 15th Master of St Edmund's College. One of the most famous quips is the art of letting someone else have your way. Less cynically, at its apogee, diplomacy exists to avoid the use of hard power, to convince one set of individuals that other individuals have both a case to be heard and inherent value.
What?
At the limit of this definition of diplomacy, can diplomacy even be defined as soft power? Or is diplomacy rather the creation and maintenance of the commons to avoid the use, ideally, of any power, when power is defined as an act by one individual or group of individuals against another used with coercive intent? Diplomatic negotiations are littered with phrases and tools. 3 that are relevant here are confidence-building measures, carve-outs, and the dreaded zero-sum game. The first is obvious. Confidence-building measures are designed to show that it is possible to work together. There is something beyond our difference that we can share and benefit from. The second is the acknowledgement that there are often things so contentious, so complicated, so impregnable to explanation and persuasion, that if there is to be any dialogue, they must be removed, parked, carved out, at least for a period, that all parties must simply agree to disagree and, crucially, in doing so, free themselves to focus on what is common. The greatest challenge to all of this, arguably the vanishing spell for diplomacy when it is framed as the art of creating the commons, the spaces we share, rather than the silver-tongued agents of power, is the zero-sum game. If you fundamentally believe that the common is finite, then your gain is my loss, or if not mine, then someone else's. There can be no true collaboration, only different forms of competition. As we look at many of the conflicts today, it would be easy to conclude that there are only zero-sum games. There is no doubt that some of the greatest challenges we need to navigate are based on the finite resources of a finite planet. What is curious, though, is how debates framed in this way span completely different categories of problem. Identity, access to water, and freedom of speech speak to 3 very different concepts of the individual in relation to the common, but are united in their regular delineation as zero-sum games. Listen carefully, and what is often happening here is that one side, or indeed both, is refusing to allow intellectual space for any common purpose, no matter how that is defined. Perhaps even more curious and disturbing is the way in which some protagonists on all sides of these debates which could find space for common ground through carve-outs and confidence-building measures, seem instead proactively to seek the relocation of complex and abstract notions into spaces that are physically finite, precisely to ensure that they can only be treated as a zero-sum. It is not necessary to locate the general in the particular. That relocation of concepts or social norms into specific finite space is a choice, and it is an act that consciously strips the other, whichever other, of the inherent capacity to be more than one side of a binary. you are with us or against us on that tiny zero-sum space, and therefore on everything. In diplomacy, this is precisely the reason there are carve-outs, because once a complex negotiation collapses into a spatio-temporary binary, that zero-sum will infect the entire system, rendering a new common almost impossible, unless it is, for a period, deliberately carved out. The space, physical and intellectual for dialogue, is therefore, in my view, essential to navigating a complex and complicated world. The next area is the space for tension. The key diplomatic tool here, though hardly the preserve of diplomacy, is the use of frameworks. I tend to think in pictures, and I realise as I draw ever more arcane doodles on whiteboards that this is not something that everyone shares, although it may say more about my drawing. But bear with me. Imagine a door. A door enables space and an opening. In the case of a standard door, these are created by a frame that consists, if the carpenter is any good, of right angles. Of course, there could be other shapes of door, but the point here is that internal and sometimes orthogonal tensions within an approach often create the very space in which dialogue can take place, most obviously for those operating within the framework, but also for those outside that framework. In academia, in fades, in philosophical systems of thought or belief, these can be highly subtle and incredibly sophisticated. For practitioners, these sophisticated systems are indeed often reduced to simple frameworks that can be returned to, almost as aide-memoire or guides. Crucially, frameworks derived from truly capacious worldviews nearly always have inherent within them a tension that removes the binary or and replaces it with and. Some very simple examples that we will all have heard used: people and planet, individual dignity and the common good, rights and responsibilities, faith and reason. In each case, the and sets up a potential tension that demands reflection and thus opens up space for dialogue. Effective frameworks, therefore, set up tensions that enable thinkers and actors both to avoid a reductionist collapse into a zero-sum game and the resulting battle between binaries, and to avoid an extreme relativism that dilutes any perspective into an endlessly shifting soup of ideas. They create both space and boundaries. One of the roles of higher education institutions is, I would argue, to help form the skills of critical thinking. More prosaically, we urgently need to form the confidence not to allow the space for dialogue to be reduced to a zero-sum. That is not to say that there isn't a legitimate debate about the most effective modality for dialogue, but the reduction of debates to a zero-sum is arguably an act of intellectual aggression, albeit one used by protagonists on all sides of the debates raging around us, that demands its own form of resistance. This brings me to my final space, the space for movement. In some ways, this is the most obvious of the three, but it can also be the hardest to achieve. In diplomacy, the movement is often constructed through different forms of compromise that enable all sides to create and agree a new common that we collectively move toward. Each is traded in different alternatives, and each have won some things, ceded others in return for the other side winning some of theirs, and neither party has been forced to go beyond their true red lines, which might, of course, never have been declared or even known by the opposite party. Often linked to a zero-sum approach, particularly when the issue isn't technically a finite resource, is an intentional denial of movement, or the conviction that to move is a defeat, an inherent loss, something undermining, not augmenting. To open oneself up to the potential for change, for movement, for metamorphosis, can be alarming for an individual, and potentially deeply threatening for more rigid and unbending modes of thought or being. which is why cultivating practices and habits of open-mindedness, of open-heartedness, of encounter that enables deep listening, movement and growth is such an important part of the formation of future thinkers and leaders, those who can help us to move past difference and forge positive and shared futures, locally and globally. The very first words of Pope Francis from the Loggia of St. Peter's on the evening of March the 12th, 2013, immediately after his election, included, "And we take up this journey, Bishop and people, this journey of the Church of Rome, a journey of fraternity, of love, of trust among us." The Pope used the word journey 3 times in his second paragraph. The Pope's subsequent focus on synodality has provided a powerful and practical reference point for those with and beyond the Church for the legitimacy, practice, and process of journey. It isn't clear from the people I've spoken to that anyone intimately involved in this journey of the Church has found it easy, but is ease the aspiration? Sister Gemma Simmons, CJ, an alumna and faculty member of St Edmund's College, was one of 4 religious charged with synthesising the contribution from hundreds of religious communities across the globe for a joint contribution to the Synod of Bishops from both the Women's and Men's International Union of Superiors. In an address for St Edmund's Patronal Festival last year, she described some of the challenges the synodal journey had raised, especially for those in positions of power or authority. From this experience, Sister Gemma highlighted listening as one of the most powerful practices to cultivate. I quote from her address. "When we listen with ears conditioned only to hearing what we want to hear, or hearing what we think we will agree with, we hear almost nothing. When we listen with our physical ears, but our mind is principally focused on producing a clever retort, we cannot open ourselves to challenge, to question, or to exploration. Above all, we are armed against the possibility that we might change or be converted by the experience, the perceptions or words of another. Perhaps this is why Jesus often prefaced his more difficult pronouncements with the words, 'Whoever has ears to hear, let them listen.' Most of his hearers certainly had physical ears, but made little use of them. In my diplomatic and leadership training, I've always been taught not to speak for more than 10 minutes, and that 20 minutes really is the longest you can expect any audience to listen. This is, of course, not the sort of deep listening the Academy demands and expects. However, for all my talk of change, we are creatures of habit, so having been asked to speak for at least 30 minutes, I want to use the last 10 minutes to change tack slightly and end with a picture. Where are we? Let's see if I can make this work. There we go. Does this work? There. Fortunately, as I said at the start, the challenge to creating space for dialogue, tension and movement is not new, even if the scale of effort demanded by a reality of 8 billion individual humans is something our brains struggle to fathom, precisely as modern technology and communication tools have added new dimensions, both to the complexity of human interactions and how we experience the world. Back in the late 14th century, most probably in Westminster, somebody sat down to illuminate the manuscript of the Apocalypse, which today sits in the Wren Library of Trinity College, Cambridge. Not much appears to have been written about this manuscript, and the little Dr. Nicholas Bell in the Wren Librarian could find when I asked him to help me search for more is terse, functional, and frankly, not terribly complimentary. Far more humble than the famous Trinity Apocalypse, a manuscript in the same collection, sometimes described as the culmination of Gothic book illumination, there is no gold. The illuminations aren't especially well composed, and it looks like the artist had recently been given a large paint box and was keen to try out every colour. And yet, despite the exceptional collection at Trinity and across the wider University of Cambridge, I kept coming back to this illuminated manuscript. Why? It was the way that these often crude paintings consistently illuminated the text in the true meaning of the word. In one case, I simply Googled what I saw, and was taken straight to the precise verse in Revelation which it depicted. That is the one I've chosen to end today, to illustrate the first section of my talk. As you can see, there are three figures on the right. Two are the many-headed beast and dragon, but it is the third that I couldn't forget. As you can see, he's a rather insouciant, grey-furred chap, his hoofed legs crossed, one hand on his knee and the other on his hip, and on his long Scooby-Doo face, peering out at us from across the centuries, is the barely suppressed yawn of the armchair pundit. He is the most, to me, deliciously drawn caricature, holding court from his pink ottoman, expecting us all to listen, doubtlessly while he tells us precisely why the Fighting Irish women's basketball team lost to Oregon State in Albany, explains why the Fed was wrong to hold interest rates at their March meeting and not how he, or anyone who remotely understood monetary policy, would handle the US economy. And for a brief couple of years, he probably gave us quite exceptional epidemiological insight into the spread and control of COVID. He is indeed the false prophet, and one can only imagine whom the monk who drew him was thinking of to capture such a perfect attitudinal likeness. So who is the false prophet according to Revelation? The false prophet exercises authority mainly through signs, but also by marking everyone on the hand or forehead, so that only those who are marked can participate in economic exchange. That haunting symbol of authoritarian control that reduces the individual to an indelible binary, insider or outsider, included or excluded. If we look again at the manuscript, we have power, authority, and control. And yet, what is that coming out of the mouths of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet? Frogs, or rather foul spirits like frogs, who will go to the kings of the world and assemble them for battle. But why frogs? In this illumination, the lowering, determined faces of the dragon and the smug hauteur of the false prophet are rendered quite ridiculous by tiny black frogs, their legs splayed to break the fall as they tumble out of their mouths. Stephen Witacek, while at the Divinity faculty at the University of Cambridge, explored this very question. Researching what frogs symbolised in Greek and Jewish literature, he concluded that frogs were, I quote, mostly thought of as disgusting and exemplarily silly. As he goes on, I quote again, even if the powers that John represents by his beast imagery are still in charge, the audience has already been given an apocalyptic, revealing, unveiling, unmasking glimpse of their true character, and a liberating laugh about them. Sometimes, humour, not always known as a core diplomatic tool, is the way to wrest open space for dialogue, especially when those with power seek to shut it down. Only this weekend, the director of NATO's strategic communications has been posting examples of how humour can be used by NATO and others to push back against disinformation and engage people in different perspectives. He posted this off the back of a fascinating Reuters paper on the Ukrainian use of humour in countering Russian disinformation. In complex times, humour matters. There's no conflict zone I have ever served in or lived in which humour was not a core part of the narrative within the public at large. It not only enables individuals to endure oppression, a criticism that has led some to blame humour for limiting protest, but it psychologically arms us against otherwise overwhelming fear, precisely so we can act. And humour also humanises. It cuts us all down to size. The mighty beasts and the dragon, who have been described in the most lurid terms, ultimately can do no more than bring forth frogs. Humour is David's tiny stone hitting square in the forehead of Goliath of power or pride that makes exclusive claims and thus strips us of the space for dialogue. So where does this leave us? It leaves me with a deep conviction that a world in need requires institutions of higher education to help form as well as educate their members, especially those schools like Notre Dame and St Edmund's that attract and send forth people who will go on to shape the world for millions in countries across the globe. I also believe, possibly because I am a practitioner and see the world in inputs, outputs, and outcomes, that while there needs to be space for the serendipitous and the unexpected magic of encounter with a person or an idea, that it is also essential that this approach to formation is done with thoughtful intentionality, especially as settings become more complex, more international, and more diverse. As Pope Francis exhorts, again referring to Fratelli Tutti, and I quote, "What is important is to create processes of encounter, processes that build a people that can accept differences. Let us arm our children with the weapons of dialogue. Let us teach them to fight the good fight of cultural encounter." At St Edmunds, we are still on a journey with our programme, but I'm just going to put us in a little bit of context with 3 slides, and you will have to forgive me. It's the Easter vacation in Cambridge, and I have prepared these slides rather than our digital expert, and it shows. But what we have in the next slides are the Royal Charter, which is our foundational document, and the document that basically is effectively unchangeable over time and the centuries. The second, you see, is our more recent mission statement that was agreed by the governing body in 2021, which sets out our mission and our purpose. You'll see a lot of global thinkers and leaders in there, and looking at the future, some of the language that you've heard me use today. And finally, and probably impossible for many people to read, you have the Thrive framework that guides the dimensions of our programme alongside the educational delivery that sits within the college and the University of Cambridge. The challenge, of course, is how this is made real in programmatic engagement. At the moment, I will be honest, we are still in the pilot stage of various different interventions. But one of the areas that I am most interested in is the processes, as the Pope has called them, or preparations for positive encounter with the exceptional global diversity within St Edmunds, especially in a world that often feels so febrile. One of the challenges we all face, of course, is engagement and sustained commitment. Much of the time, we just want to get through the day, while vaguely wishing there was something we could do. For many of us, the seeming scale and intractability of the challenges facing our world can feel overwhelming. There are no simple solutions. But this clamouring and complicated world needs people like you to find new ways to address the problem of the commons, new ways that work for people and planet. That has never been easy. In every generation, the beast, the dragon, and the false prophet lurk, and we will all need resilience. So don't forget those silly, silhouetted frogs. And remember sometimes to laugh at yourself, at our common weakness, and at the extraordinary fact that we are each alive, all 8 billion of us. Laugh not to diminish yourself or others, but laugh so that you have the strength to continue the journey. As Pope Francis said in his Christmas address to the Courier, and I leave you with the quote from that, "Let us remain vigilant against rigid ideological positions that often, under the guise of good intentions, separate us from reality and prevent us from moving forward. Let us always keep journeying forward with humility and wonder, lest we fall into the presumption of thinking we have arrived." Thank you.
Thank you so much. While you think about your questions, I will ask the first 2 questions. In the spirit of dialogue, I have a micro question and a macro question.
Oh, I
and
brought a
they're
pen
both
to
very
write
simple. You
them
don't need a
down.
pen. No, you don't need a pen at all.
I might.
No, you don't. My micro question is, how do you teach deep listening, humor, and this kind of positive encounter? How does one teach that? And we are really interested in that as the Kiel School, right? Yes, so that's my first micro question.
It's an excellent question.
Thank you.
I don't think I have the answer. And I think one of the things I've been trying to do throughout my time at St Edmunds is to recognise that there are almost two levels of discussion about this. There are thousands of organisations around the world that have spent decades and centuries developing tools and frameworks in order to encourage deep listening. A cynic would say if they've been doing it for centuries, why hasn't it worked? But I don't think that's really the point. The point is this is something that will never have an end. It's something that we keep needing to do. So one of the things that has been in the forefront of my mind during my mastership is to not attempt to reinvent a wheel, but to find partners who already have demonstrated ability. We have several local partners within Cambridge who have spent years in the space of reconciliation, for example. As I've already mentioned, Sister Gemma has been intimately involved in the synodal journey. Each of these comes with processes that we can adopt or adapt, or indeed partners who we can frankly get to be delivery partners. You can tell I've been a diplomat. I like thinking in this way. So I think there's that level at which one can work with people who already have experience in this area, either to, working with students or faculty is at some level not that different from working with leadership programs that I've been in the Foreign Office, or working with reconciliation programs that some of our membership have done in the Middle East or indeed across the world. The other layer, which I think is harder, but something that many in the college feel very strongly about, including me, is we are ultimately an academic and research institution. So as we go on this journey, how are we actually going to consider this problem from a research perspective? We have several members of the faculty who sit within the University of Cambridge's Department of Education, for example, who are looking at some of these aspects. But if I'm honest, I don't feel that interaction is where it shouldn't be yet. But I do feel that there's space for, self-evidently, for academic psychology in here. There's space in here for academic assessment of prior practice. And then there's also that area which I think practitioners would consider academic and academics would probably consider to be practice, which actually requires both, which is sophisticated monitoring and evaluation. And we haven't answered that question yet, but I think that would be partly the answer. And I think if you talk about deep listening, again, we'll each have experience of different frameworks. I've always been quite a fan of a particular practice in which you take two people. Obviously, it's quite labour intensive because it's usually individual on either side of a disagreement. And sometimes you can, if they're both confident and comfortable, you can do this in a slightly more public setting with a few people observing the interaction, although it does depend where you are. And the very simple version of the practice is that the first person is given up to 5 minutes to explain their perspective on the issue. The person who has been listening then has to paraphrase what they've said, and they have the opportunity to say, is that fair or is it not? And if they say, no, it's not, they then have another period where they're allowed to explain why it wasn't fair, and they mirror it back. And you keep doing that until you come to a pithy version from the opposite party of why the other person feels the way they do. And then you reverse the process. Because in that process, you've had to have listened very, very attentively in order to be able to give your rendered down version of what you think you've heard.
I loved it. Let's try it. Other question. Thank you so much. We really tried it, right, Gareth? Tried it. Yes, we will. The other question is, integral human development is the defining slogan of the Q School and important for us at Nanovic. And two pillars are common good and dignity.
Yes, yeah.
And you think back of your time as ambassador in Mongolia, which role would, the ideas, dignity and common good have played in your service?
I genuinely think, I can see Andres at the back here, who ran a fantastic session in London in January, looking at questions of poverty and inequality, bringing academics from Notre Dame to your London Gateway. And this was being done through a prism of integral human development. So my short answer to that is that this is precisely the sort of framework that I think it is essential that practitioners have. I will be honest that the volume of emails, the volume of traffic, the volume of priorities, the volume of reports back to London, the volume of Zoom calls. We had Zoom long before everyone had Zoom because we're an internationally distributed organisation, or there was something else at the time, is such that you often do develop tunnel vision. You need to achieve this objective, and that's not the same as saying by any means, because that you are praised as a diplomat within the UK Foreign Service on the values as well as on the competences that are required. But I think it is very useful to have frameworks like IHD that actually remind you why you're doing it. And I think, and that there are sometimes these tensions. The thing that might be the perfect solution for the 95% are not for the 5%. And so how do you ensure that as you're taking decisions with what, as somebody in public service, is always a finite amount of money, as you take those decisions, how do you ensure that you are, a word I use a lot, taking a conscious choice? When a leader takes a decision, there is always somebody who is affected negatively by that decision. And what you can develop in your thoughtful and ethical leadership practice, I think, is the habit of intentionality and the consciousness of that choice. Because at least then you know why you have allowed some people not to benefit, rather than simply not reflecting on that group of people or individual.
Thank you. It was powerful when you reminded us of the individuals. 8 billion people, yes, but individuals in their uniqueness. Floor is open, friends, for respectful questions of yes.
Hello, I'm a business professor here at McAllen journalistic program. I'm wondering, as shaped by your reduction again career and how did that contribute to your later development in your thinking about diplomacy's role in these other areas?
Thank you.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think all of us have been on our own personal life journey, and therefore we're all going to be affected by what we saw. Those in the diplomacy class who've had one-to-ones with me might have heard bits of this story. I'm going to be honest and say I've been powerfully naive at different points in my life journey. I actually started out my career as a management consultant. That was, it was a phenomenal organisation, but if I'm honest, it came about through a failure of imagination. I was graduating, I didn't quite know what to do, and I thought this would be a good next career step. And I will always defend, in retrospect, the fact that I learnt probably more in those 18 months as a management consultant that has been useful than almost anywhere else in my career. But I decided that I hadn't found my purpose, and I decided to pivot to journalism with high levels of naivety. And I went out to Iraq in 2003 and helped set up an Arabic and English language newspaper there, which was probably beyond naive and into faintly delusional. And that led to a period of my life where I was mainly a freelance journalist. I'm setting that up because the really relevant aspect of my story, in answer to your question, is that I was very powerfully motivated by the individual stories. And I think that forging experience somewhere like Iraq in 2003, where you had these massive international frameworks crashing in to millions of people's individual lives in all sorts of unexpected ways, was a very, very powerful backdrop for understanding that no matter how intentionally, consciously and thoughtfully policymakers take decisions, they cannot have that access to the individuals who they are impacting, and that it is journalists and journalism quite often, or the NGO community, that manages to elevate those individual stories into a public or a public sector consciousness. I have to say, though, by the time I found myself in Yemen, so I moved around bits of the Middle East for a period, I was still really captivated by these individual stories. But personally, and this probably says more about me than anything else, I was increasingly frustrated by the fact that even had I been, which I was not, a sort of award-winning journalist, there was only so far that I could go. All I was ever at some level able to do was take stories, analyse them, and powerfully attempt to influence others. I was not actually the decision maker, who were those others? And that actually that was probably where I personally felt I was better able to have a positive effect. And that's what saw my move into diplomacy. What I've tried to retain throughout, though, is ensuring that no matter how busy I am, or no matter how senior I'm seen to be, and one of the great advantages of Mongolia is it's an exceptionally unhierarchical society coming from the sort of nomadic history. So what I'm about to describe was much easier than it would have been if I had been ambassador to China, for example, is to create habits of encounter, moments where I am talking to individuals so that I can keep myself adequately informed of at least some of the stories in some small way, but also ensuring that the classic second secretary in our system, those sort of early people overseas, are not just going out and getting information, but they're actually attempting to gain knowledge as well as information, and maybe local wisdom as well as knowledge and information, so that they can help insofar as we can to inform our decision making. And crucially, I don't think there's a diplomat on the planet who doesn't rely on journalists in private and personal conversations to heavily inform a more authentic version of what's really going on. Because the moment you are a diplomat, you can't remove that identifier from yourself, and people won't always tell you the truth.
No. Thank you. Morgan, please, instead of first Morgan is the
Clarence, thank you very much for some of the talk. With the idea of diplomatic thinking from your respect, I hope that I could ask a question that you didn't include, but about emotion and the role of emotion in our thinking and in our decision-making in these conversations that I can imagine can become very emotional and not seeing emotions as something to fight, but to work with. And I just like your opinions on that.
It's very interesting. Again, I think, so back when I joined the Foreign Office, we're going back to frameworks again, and I know that academics tend to, certainly in Cambridge, they hate these sort of psychometric tools that the rest of us use all the time. So forgive me. When I first joined the Foreign Office was heavily in love with the Myers-Briggs test. We used it an awful lot. I mean, we recognised its limitations, but we just found it was quite a useful proxy. So bear with me on that. We use certain others more now. But I think my crude answer to that is one of the things these tools offer a proxy for is crudely, who have you got in the room and where are their innate preferences? And that it enables you to be more conscious of the emotional and perceptional biases that you might have in the room. Mm-hmm. So my short answer would be that you always want to try, if you can, either to be conscious of your own bias towards thinking or feeling, or make sure you've got some sort of diversity in the room there, because they do often come to powerfully different conclusions. And I think the equality versus equity debate is a classic example of that. Do you rationally divide the pie into 10, or do you give people the thing that they most need? So that's a sort of woolly answer. I think that as a diplomat, most diplomats, if they're honest, will say that instinctive gut reactions are important. But what's as important is that you hold them and then make sure you're doing some proper analysis as well. And that the best decisions are taken when the analysis has lined up with the emotional, instinctive reaction. And more often than not, it doesn't. But I had some powerful instances where my instinct has definitely been wrong, and I've been jolly glad, given the magnitude of the decision, that I've done the proper analytical part of that as well. But ultimately, diplomacy is about people. And, people are about a certain level of emotion and engagement. So it is important.
Thank you. Professor Xenman, please talk.
Hi, thanks for the talk. And could you maybe talk a little bit about how diplomatic practices, as you described, intersect the democratic political process, where politicians succeed not through the tactics that you described, like by drawing sharp differences, setting zero-sum games to those billions of constituents and winning elections that way. It seems to me that these two systems at the mass level and then maybe at an elite diplomatic level operate in different domains. And is there any way that we can talk about that we somehow bring them together?
My very unfair and slightly flippant answer was, if only I could have given you an answer to that question, because it's one that I think is vexing thinkers, wherever you find them, thinkers in the academy, thinkers within the practitioner spheres, thinkers within think tanks within the UK and elsewhere, because it is, again, I'm unconvinced it is a new problem, but the sheer scale and the way that technology and modern forms of communication has accelerated and advantaged certain approaches, I think is one of the most terrifying issues that we will need to engage with over the rest of this century. And it is urgent and it is necessary. I mean, perhaps if I talk a little bit more about the UK system, which I'm more conversant with, one of the reasons why the UK manages to have the influence that we still do around the world is because of our civil service. And effectively sitting underneath our political, sometimes maelstrom, is this really genuinely beautiful system. I can get quite emotional about it, more emotional now I'm on the outside than I ever was on the inside. In the inside, it was red tape and it was bureaucracy and it was annoying. And now on the outside, I can see how if you have this amazing piece of clockwork, it might feel constraining, but the very constraint is what's generating better decision-making. And that constraint, in large part, is still around our political class. And this is one of the inherent tensions, is it is not the civil servants constraining the ministers in a classic parody. I don't know if anyone likes British comedy, but if you don't watch Yes, Minister, it's genuinely one of the funniest series that has ever been created. Nor is it what some of the political discourse in recent years in the UK has described as the blob. And it's one of the things that I think many very thoughtful people in the UK are most alarmed by, is it is not a party political statement to say that attempting to achieve a short-term mass effect by undermining a system that has delivered intentionality, thoughtful decision-making for all parties for decades is a short-term expediency against which all reflective people, be those politicians or civil servants, and you've seen it very much coming from both, one in quiet, one in public, need to be guarding against. Because once those systems and structures are gone, it takes a very, very, very long time to develop them. And I mean, that's partly what I've seen as a diplomat. A lot of our work is institutional reform, renovation in countries where democracy, for example, is much younger and haven't had the time to build these systems and structures. And they are craving the very systems, thoughtful, well-calibrated, balanced systems and structures that enable a society at scale to move towards concepts of the common good, precisely as not uniquely our countries, but many countries around the world have actors who are seeking short-term, politically expedient goals.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes or so. Brief question, please.
This was a great presentation. I really appreciate it. But I'd like to ask you a question about a case where diplomacy should have, and I think wasn't done. And this is, of course, in Israel today. I'm not a historian, but I think I remember some. It was about 75 years ago, written out to take a number of Jews back to their ancestral homeland, which was a place occupied for over 2,000 years by Palestinians. And to the best of my knowledge, there was no attempt to help to make this a bicultural place for them to survive. And I think they dropped the ball on this. And about 2 years ago, I read an interesting book called Because We Said So, which was written by Noam Chomsky, who is a Jewish linguist, and he is very critical of Israel and the Jewish structure because, I'm paraphrasing, people like Golda Meir, if I remember this correctly, we'd be much better off if we get rid of all of these pyramids. And a good example of making a multicultural society is here in the United States. Because I think about 98% of our population comes from different cultures, and I think I'm fairly typical that I'm in a multicultural marriage, and it's lasted for 57 years. I think it's surpassed it.
And more years to come. And your question is?
So, would diplomacy have solved this problem?
So it's a fascinating question, and I think sort of almost starting at the back and then moving forward and attempting to give an answer which is inherently going to be, and would warn you, a non-answer. The way that the US has approached your exceptional multinational, multi-diverse, multi-faith society is indeed one that the world has been watching for centuries and learning from. So yes, there are absolutely, different countries do approach it differently, but there are absolutely exceptional examples in the US of how this can be done positively and successfully for all, and building those commons we've been discussing. I mean, if we look at more recent events in Gaza and Israel, I mean, what happened on the 7th of October and what has happened since, I don't think there are any observers who do not believe that those have been truly awful events. I think the reason that I'm not going to be able to authentically answer your question is that I am not an area, although I've spent a lot of my career in the Middle East, I have never served in Israel or the occupied Palestinian territories, and I'm just not adequately expert to know. What I do know is that the diplomatic services across the world are intensively involved in what is unfolding in the Holy Land. However, one of the things that I feel very strongly about on all of these complex issues that are facing us is that what they really need are experts, not people who are non-expert opining. And I'm afraid if I opined on the detail of that, I would simply be a non-expert in opining. So I can't offer you what you're looking for, other than to say that I am confident that there are experts in diplomatic services around the world that will be doing everything they can to find diplomatic solutions to what is a terrible series of events.
Thank you. So we have basically 1 minute left, and what I would suggest is, if you had 1 minute to give us something on our journey to live with and be nourished from, what would it be?
Keep open the space for debate and dialogue.
I've heard bipartisan tie. Do you see that?
Yes, there you go. Keep open that space, no matter how hard it is.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you all for being here or having been here soon. We want to thank Catherine, which we just did. I also want to thank our friends from the technology, from comms. I see Keith here, from our events. I see Mel, our friends from the Nanovic. Thank you for being here. Don't forget, diplomatic thinking can bring you far in life. And with this, I wish you a good rest of the day, and a good rest of your lives. Thank you so much.
Thank you.